Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, I don't know what this is, the fourth in our series, our Law, Politics, and the Media lecture series for this year. We are pleased to have with us David Marburger, who is a partner in the Cleveland office of Baker Hostetler. He is an expert media lawyer, having litigated many libel cases, constitutionality challenges to media-related laws and court orders. He has defended against prior restraints. He has sued for access on many occasions, so the full range of media law. He has also worked before state, local, and federal government agencies and courts, and he has defended and pursued copyright claims. He is an experienced litigant before the appellate litigant, but before the Ohio Supreme Court. He has also, so he's made law in that regard. He's also made law with regard to the drafting of legislation, including amendments to Ohio's open records and open meeting statutes. He has represented online media, major national television and radio networks, newspapers, book publishers, magazines, outdoor advertising companies, and wire services. He is a graduate of the Newhouse School. He was, after graduation from Syracuse University, he worked as a journalist in a top 10 market, Pittsburgh, and he earned his law degree from the University of Pittsburgh. And we're very delighted to have him today. He's going to talk about how copyright is killing the news business. Please welcome David Marburger.
Am I allowed to take off my jacket?
Absolutely.
Does that matter?
Yes, you are.
Thanks for having me. I'm real pleased to be here. And I'm one of the few people that I know who was blessed with a job that I get to do exactly what I wanted to do when I graduated from Syracuse. And since 1983, I have been representing the press almost full-time in litigation as plaintiff or defendant. One of the things that probably the thing that got your attention is stuff that my brother and I have done recently. And we have been asked to speak at Columbia and Stanford and Cardozo Law School, Stanford. We have been asked at Columbia. We haven't gone there. And we've been asked to speak at University of Kansas, all over the place, about something that we wrote, and has received enormous publicity. And you probably have this Los Angeles Times op-ed piece that is something that appeared in the Los Angeles Times 2 summers ago that attracted a lot of attention. And I guess you've had to read. Did they have to read the longer piece? We are very concerned about what's happening to the news business and why is it happening? What can you do about it? But you have to first identify some of the, and there probably is no one single thing you can do about it. But one of the things that you might be able to do about it is what we are advocating. But to get to what we're advocating, let me tell you about some of the things that that aren't in the pieces that you've read. Before there was copyright, people who, in Europe, people who had printing presses, which were fairly, they were the internet of that world, a completely new way to mass communicate. The people who owned the printing presses would write books or pamphlets, or they would have other people write them and print them and disseminate them, and there was no such thing as copyright. Well, over time, they found, and they would disseminate them for money. They would want to be compensated for that. And over time, other printers found that a nice way to make money, but with somewhat lower costs, would be to take a book that's already out there and circulating and people are interested in, and just reprint it. Just take it and republish it. and circulated, in effect, in competition with the original book. Over time, what that caused was that printers decided it was no longer lucrative enough, no longer in their financial best interest to originate books. So there was a time in Europe where books were underproduced because the originators of books were were expending all of the labor, the effort, the cost to produce the books, and a competitor printer was simply republishing that same book and circulating it. And obviously, what does that do? If you have if you have Roy and this young lady and that young lady all republishing a book that I wrote, and let's assume we're all trying to sell it at the same time, they're going to compete with each other because she wants most people to buy her version. He wants most people to buy his version. He's going to undercut her in price. She's going to try to undercut him in price. If I try to meet their price, what's going to happen to me? I'm going out of business. Because if I try to meet, what's going to happen is their competition with each other will drive the price down for that book. And it will be driven down to approximately what their costs were to produce the book plus an adequate profit acceptable to them. But their costs to produce the book were lower than my costs to originate the content of the book and to print it. Their costs are limited to printing. My costs are printing, plus I've got to originate the content. So when they compete against each other, they drive down the market price for my book, and if I try to meet their market price, what's going to happen? It'll be below my costs. I've got to stop publishing. I've got to stop this publishing business. It's a loser. It's a loser. So what have they done? They've driven me, the originator, out of business. Now what are they going to do? One of them's going to have to write a book if they want to keep their printing press going and want to be in that business. So Roy says he'll be the author. So these two ladies and the lady next to them, they decide they're going to do the same thing to Roy as they all did to me, and pretty soon Roy's out of business. Well, ultimately, one of the reasons, but not by any means the only reason, a reason you have copyright today was to stop that kind of free riding. That's called free riding. You probably read in the, well, I guess I should explain further. Obviously now if I have the copyright and the courts will recognize my copyright as the author of that piece, obviously now when they copy and go into competition with me with my own book, they are at risk. And they are at risk of what happens if I sue and win. And what are their options then? Their options are to license the rights to republish my book or to not republish my book. There are arguably other options, but those are the principal ones. Now that enabled the authors to be compensated and to be able to commercially exploit not just the authors, but the people who put the whole machinery into originating content. It enabled them to get paid back and to stay in business and to make a profit they found to be acceptable. But until that time, you had in Europe the underproduction of books because printers opted out of the book publishing business because they couldn't make money basically subsidizing their competitors. You read in our piece about the little red hen, didn't you? The little red hen is doing all the work to make the bread and no one will help her. She finally bakes the bread. And what happens? The animals suddenly want to help eat it. That's okay. But what if you had a law that said that the animals were allowed to help, the other barnyard animals are allowed to help themselves to the little red hen's finished bread without having to compensate the Little Red Hen for it, and all they have to do is promise either to change it a little bit, maybe put some icing on it, or add cinnamon or something. And now each of the barnyard animals goes out and opens up a roadside stand to sell her bread. She has a roadside stand selling her bread. And what do you think happens? The same thing with the book. That's exactly what's going to happen. The barnyard animals will compete with each other to sell the bread. That will drive down the price that each charges for her bread. She will try to meet that price. And when she does, the price will be below her costs, and ultimately the Little Red Hen will say, I'm out of business. I'm not going to make bread anymore, so you guys can make money and drive the market price for bread down so low that I can't possibly make a profit. In fact, I'm losing money, and I don't want to do that. The Copyright Act acts that way today. The Copyright Act compels you, Roy Gutterman, and when you author something, it compels you, if it's a factual piece, to subsidize all your competitors. And you can do nothing about it, and it encourages it. Now, what happens in our barnyard story? When the Little Red Hen goes out of business, the other animals didn't want to put her out of business because she supplied the bread. They didn't want to put her out of business. But they had no choice. Because for them to stay in business, they had to compete with each other and with her. And now she's gone. They have no bread to sell. Their road stands are empty. And so, again, Roy steps up to the plate and says, I'll bake the bread. And now the other barnyard animals do the same thing to Roy that they did to the Little Red Hen, and Roy's out of business. That's one of the things that has happened today in the news business. And what has caused it is the Internet. What has the Internet done? Well, let's look at it. Before I answer that question, let's look at it. I want you to see, rather than me tell you what it's done, I want you to see what happens, and you'll come to that conclusion on your own. Until Murdoch launched the Daily the other day, on February 1, I guess he launched it, you can get it for 2 weeks for free right now. Until that happened, did you see a lot of news sites opening up where they originated their own news coverage that would approximate that of a large daily metropolitan newspaper? Did you see that? Wouldn't you think that those would be everywhere? Wouldn't you think that? Wouldn't you expect this? I'm an entrepreneur. I see. Of course, you also have to understand a little bit about money. Entrepreneurs just want to make money. So if they can make more money by putting their capital in a bank account to yield interest, they'll do that. If they can make more money by owning a business which will yield a lot more money than a bank account interest would earn, they'll do that. Capital is about what it earns for you. So you always have to think in terms of capital as being something that generates money. All right? Now, wouldn't you think, you're an entrepreneur, you're looking for a way to generate money. You have $1 million, maybe you have $1 million in your bank account and it's earning 1%. You've got to generate some money and you're looking for, well, what can I do with this money that'll give a lot more to me? And the answer might be geez, look around. The major metropolitan newspapers are spending exorbitant sums to distribute their product. They are paying truck drivers. They're paying, the amount of money involved to move a newspaper from the plant to each house that receives home delivery is huge. And, geez, if I hired a whole bunch of Roy Guttermans to come over and work for me, couldn't I put my local metropolitan newspaper out of business? Because I could have my own newspaper website, couldn't I? And I could originate all the, let's take the Plain Dealer, which Roy used to work for the Plain Dealer, and that's a newspaper that I represent too, which is a big metropolitan newspaper in Cleveland. With great penetration. The Plain Dealer is very proud that it has extremely heavy penetration in its market, that has a lot of households. I could put the PD out of business. I'll hire all those journalists. I'll create my own online newspaper. No distribution costs to speak of. I ought to be able to run them out of business, no problem. My costs would be way less. I'd have the same journalistic costs roughly, but all the other costs, which are heavy, of distributing the paper, I wouldn't have at all. Well, why haven't you seen people do that? Wouldn't you expect that entrepreneurs would see that there's that possibility? That, gee, you could undercut the institutional press simply by taking all of the journalists that you could hire, originate your own news content, and drive the old media out of business. Because the old media is still spending exorbitant amounts of money to distribute hard copy newspapers. But you don't see that, do you? Do you see anybody doing that other than right now The Daily is doing it via the iPad app that Murdoch and Apple have agreed upon, News Corp and Apple? Well, there's a reason why that's not happening. It's not because you can't think of content that people want. People want the newspaper's content. Any newspaper website in a major metropolitan area has far more unique visitors to its website than any other news site that carries that kind of news. Let's take all the broadcast, all the television and radio websites in a particular community that carry local news, and compare the unique visitors to those to the newspaper's website, and they are combined. They're just a fraction of what the newspaper's number of unique visitors to newspaper websites. So wouldn't you think that there's obviously news content is still very attractive to people, extremely attractive to people? Wouldn't you think the entrepreneur would say, well, I'm going to start my own newspaper online, and I'm not going to distribute hard copy, and I'll put the hard copy guys out of business, but yet nobody's doing that. One of the reasons they're not doing it is they know that if they spend all this money to originate their own news, that you guys can all open up the competing websites, rewrite the news, post it on your sites, sell ads around it really inexpensively, compete with each other to do it, and basically make it so that I lose my investment. I become the little red hen, and I'm out of business. And I submit to you that one of the reasons nobody is creating the Plain Dealer online as a single sustaining newspaper, I mean, hardly anybody is. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer is trying it, but how successful are they? Not at all. They are not even close to being an image of what they were as a hard copy paper in terms of the amount of coverage, the depth of coverage, the variety of coverage, that sort of thing. Because the Copyright Act does, in truth, and even more so by perception, allows you guys to take what Roy originated and compete with him in the same medium at the same time against him. And all for advertisers. And so the entrepreneur says, why should I go take that risk when I can open newser.com and I'll just lift the best stuff out there that the originators have produced, and I'll put it out there at the same time that they do, and maybe mine will be shorter, but mine will be there, and I'll sell ad space around mine, and there are websites all over the place doing this. And in the end, because those, I call them aggregators, whether that's the correct label or not is debatable, but I call them that. There's so many of them competing against each other, they drive down the market rate for advertising online so that because it's they so depress it. The way I got interested in this, by the way, was that I was doing a seminar with the editor of the Plain Dealer one day. Her name, she just left there, her name was Susan Goldberg. And during her part of the presentation, she said, she made an offhand remark saying that online ad rates are so low, they're a joke, they can't make any money on online display ads. And I thought at the time, well, you're just accepting that as the truth, Susan. You're just accepting that as the landscape. But there's a reason for that. I mean, it isn't that online ads are worthless in terms of their ability to reach people. They reach plenty of people. So there's something that's driving the market down for online advertising and depressing the rates. Something is doing that. It's not some intrinsic. It's not the intrinsic nature of the of online. There's some economic market force that's doing it. And so my brother, who's an economics professor, and his specialty is the economics of sports, the economics of professional and collegiate sports. I got him interested in this. I said, I think that the reason is the reason that I'm now talking to you about. My hunch was that was the reason, and we did a lot of work to see if that hunch was baloney or not, and we decided it's not baloney. That it's a serious problem, and it's created by the legal landscape in our country. And our country is resistant to resist. In fact, the very industry that needs help, the originator of news industry, and particularly the newspaper publishers, are fractured about what to do. They are not joined. There is no unanimity. There is a great deal of disagreement between do nothing to try to pass a federal law, try to nonprofit news, sort of NPR and print, and this lack of unanimity is creating inaction. And the underproduction of news is obvious to anybody here. We now know news is today being vastly underproduced. We know anybody that's in a major metropolitan area, maybe outside of New York City, but certainly in a St. Louis, a Pittsburgh, a Cincinnati, a Cleveland, can see the newspaper going like this. They're just shadows of what they once were, and this has only happened in the last 2 years. One news organization that we represent, the head of it told me that now they have decided they will no longer cover court cases. They will no longer cover city council meetings. They're not going to cover the routine stuff that newspapers have always covered: trials, city council, county commissioner, those kinds of things. Their theory is, well, they're not going to cover press conferences because people can get those press conferences on their own through the web. Well, yeah, right. I want to sit through an hour press conference when I otherwise could read a reporter's summation of it. I can tell you I don't want to sit through. I don't want to read the transcript of an oral argument. I want to hear the crux of it from a reporter. The real reason that they're not covering trials, city council meetings, and the like is they have to underproduce the news in order to keep them going under. Their ad revenues are not meeting their costs, so they've got to cut journalistic costs. They cut the costs by getting rid of journalists and thereby covering less. Well, what do you think happens when they do that? We perceive that the newspaper stinks. People laugh at the newspaper. Oh, man, that thing is a rag. They always maybe called a newspaper a rag, but it's more of a rag than ever before because now It has so little to offer in terms of wide-ranging, in-depth stories. And so we patronize the newspaper less. Well, what does that happen? What happens then? Circulation down, advertisers willing to pay less, got to cut more journalists. Ultimately, with a depressed advertising market, news will not only be underproduced, and it is being underproduced today, but you'll have fewer vendors to choose from. Because I think since 2008, I think we've lost 166 newspapers. I think. We've had numerous big metro dailies going into bankruptcy and just now coming out of bankruptcy, but bankruptcy in those instances we're not liquidating the newspaper, meaning, you know, making it go away forever, but reorganizing the paper. But the people who are critics of the newspaper industry say, oh, you don't understand online. You don't know how to make a product that's attractive to online. Well, how could we have these people who are in business for 150 years doing great, and then all of a sudden, at the same time, in the course of 3 years, they're all going out of business because they all got stupid? How could that happen? Don't tell me they don't know how to put on a product that you want. I guarantee you that they know how to put on a product that you want. But what they can't do, and it's not within their control, they can't overcome the depression in the advertising market. Now let's talk a little bit more about what causes that depression, more than what I've already told you. Keeping in mind that the entrepreneurs see that it is a losing proposition to create the daily on the web. They won't hire 300 journalists to compete with the plain dealer. They won't do that because it's too risky. Everybody can take whatever they originate and compete against them with it in real time. Now, because entrepreneurial people realize, though, that they can have news websites, they can have them, but they can have them by taking the news he originated, rewriting it, and selling ad space around it, and have a 3 or 4 person staff. Or in Huffington Post, had 200 employees. 200 employees, I don't know how many of those were writers, but they didn't even pay their writers. They didn't even pay the people who posted content on Huffington Post. She just sold that thing for $315 million. And that kind of makes me sick. But back to the point. When Huffington Post, Daily Beast just got, I don't remember who purchased who. Daily Beast bought Newsweek, or did Newsweek buy up Daily Beast? I don't know how that worked, but that was real recent too. And Daily Beast and Huffington Post were free riders. They were not they did not originate journalism to any great extent, to a tiny extent. Very tiny, fractional. They achieved audiences by free riding on what the originators of news produced, and then giving little summaries of it with courtesy links at the bottom. Now, when you can attract Huffington Post and Daily Beast and others into the online market because they free ride on what he originally writes, you're attracting a lot of people into the market who want to go for those dollars at relatively low costs. And what happens when you do that on the internet? Well, the internet is infinite. Pretty much, I think. So you're creating ad space. Do you see that every time a news website opens, it creates, if it's commercial, it creates more ad space. Now, what happens when you have a lot of ad space? Let's take the billboard industry. You know, they have digital billboards now. You've seen the digital billboards. I assume Syracuse has them. Digital billboards will, every 8 seconds, they'll have a new message up. Now, in an hour, they won't have every 8 seconds a completely new message. They recycle the messages, but the messages change about every 8 seconds. And maybe they'll have 10 messages that'll rotate, or 6 messages that'll rotate throughout the day, something like that. Well, if every billboard that exists today was a digital billboard, the outdoor advertising companies would go broke. Can you imagine that? You'd think that they'd be raking it in, wouldn't you? What happens is, if you have too much ad space, the supply exceeds the demand. And it drives down the rates that you can charge for that space. And the billboards are a kind of a nice example because they are analogous to the internet. If you take let's take a metropolitan area perhaps like Syracuse. If you remove the government restrictions on where you could put billboards, and you said you can have, as long as you keep them a certain size, you can have billboards in a lot more places than the zoning laws currently allow. At first, 6 outdoor advertising companies will converge on the market, and they'll be putting up billboards all over the place. Thinking, oh yeah, if one billboard makes me $10,000 a month, how many will 20 make me? They'll make me 20. They'll make me, 20 times 10,000. I will be kicking. And so that's what they'll do. And then what will happen? No billboard will make $10,000 a month for them anymore. The billboards will make less and less and less because there's only so much demand for advertising space. If you have a glut in advertising space, what does that do? It drives down the amount of money you can charge to any advertiser, provided you don't have a monopoly on the space. As long as there are competitors who also have space, as long as you're competing with people that have advertising space, you guys will compete against each other, and if there is a glut of ad space, somebody's going out of business. And that's what's happening on the internet. And so when the lure of easy profit, do you know that these aggregator sites don't even have salespeople? I can start a business and make a profit without any salespeople? How does that happen? Who ever heard of being able to sell advertising with no salesmen or women? But they can do it because they get feeds of ads from places like Google Ads or advertising networks that sell cheap ads to Sears or to Target. And those cheap ads, the newspaper websites, they can't sell some of their space. So these advertising networks supply ads to fill that space, but at cut rate. And so my point is, profits are easy for these little aggregators, or at least perceived to be easy, because in economics, perception is a great deal of the ballgame. And so they attract an influx of news aggregators who don't originate their own stuff. And every time another site opens up, if it's commercial, so does ad space. And so you have a glut of advertising space that would be available to reach the demographic of people that like news, and therefore attract advertisers that like that demographic. And if this is allowed to continue without any change in the legal landscape, you're never going to get rid of the glut. And underproduction of news is inevitable. And nothing can stop it. I don't care how great your content is. A deity could create that content for you. But as long as he can take my content and compete against me in real time with it, the deity has done me no good. I don't care how wonderful the content is. If you can free ride on it, I'm going out of business. There's just absolutely no way to stop it if the legal landscape doesn't do something to create a barrier for this. But do you understand now what happens in a space like the internet, where you can infinitely expand the amount of space available for ads, reaching the same demographic? Why the little red hen scenario is reality. What we advocate doing, and I know I only have a couple of minutes left, if you've read the paper, I guess I'm telling you something you already know. Did they read the paper I emailed to you or the old paper?
Either or.
Okay, because the new one has a lot more stuff in it than the old one. But the new one being about a year old. But things change so fast. Stuff that we wrote last April, we want to change now because, especially with iPad has changed a lot of things, and is a surprising development in a negative way. I think, in a way. I mean, I thought iPad would be great for the news business, and now I'm less. I still think it might be, but I'm less sure of that. What we advocate that Congress do is send a message, and send it loud and clear. Amend Section 301 of the Copyright Act to say expressly that the common law tort of unfair competition, as it would apply to publication, the things that copyright applies to, not be abolished. To make it crystal clear to every court out there that this is not an issue you have to litigate and decide, that the Copyright Act does not abolish the doctrine of unfair competition as it applies to publications. And while that is certainly not going to make the difference between company or the Minneapolis Star Tribune being bankrupt and not being bankrupt, what we believe would ultimately happen if Congress made that statement, basically restoring, or if not restoring, emphasizing to all the judges that the unfair competition tort is alive and well. And if you guys have read my papers, my brothers and my papers, we're talking about the INS versus Associated Press case of 1918 decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, reinvigorating that and announcing in Congress that that's still good law. So you don't have to litigate whether that is good law or not. It is, make it good law. And we think what that would, well, certainly not a panacea by any means. But what it might do, if you don't do it, the bathtub water is coming out of the bathtub. The bathtub is draining, it's going to be gone. So you've got to plug the bathtub up with something that will give publishers confidence that they can publish original news without being free-ridden on by direct competitors, and will tell direct competitors that you're taking a tremendous risk if you free ride in direct competition with a news originator. Perhaps that would go a long way to stemming the influx of news websites that are based on free riding on original news material. Perhaps that would put a plug in the bathtub so the water is at least stable, and the news businesses can work from there to see what they can do in this brand new environment. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I hit the time like you told me, Professor.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have 20 minutes for questions, and I forgot to mention at the beginning that, of course, those of you who've been here before know that after that we will recess to the hall, and everyone's invited to partake in a reception. But for now, let's continue the conversation.
Yes.
Don't want to take up too much time, but I actually have 3 quick questions. I'm curious how the daily factors into this discussion, considering it is doing the things that you said that entrepreneurs wouldn't do or couldn't do, because let's say Cleveland or so on and so forth. How likely is it that the law will change based on your recommendation or the recommendation of others, or in the way that you would recommend? And why isn't this just a business model issue?
Well, you just used the phrase I hate, business model. It's become the cliche of what's wrong with the news business. I'm teasing you. I do hate it, but it's not your fault. Let's start with Murdoch. Well, Murdoch has a huge organization. They've invested a lot of money in the Daily. We'll see if it works. The day after the Daily came out, aggregators were the Daily's free right now. So people were, within a day, you had aggregator sites coming up summarizing what was on the Daily. If you don't stop that, the Daily isn't going to make it. Because why am I going to pay for the Daily if I can get a substitute for nothing? The Daily, I think, is charging $40 a year. Is that right? $40 a year. Why spend 40? Even price sensitive on the internet, the consumers of news are really price sensitive. If they can get a substitute, a close substitute for the Daily without paying for it, they'll do it. It is kind of odd. I'll pay 75 cents in a vending machine for a hard copy, but I don't want to pay for the exact same content from the exact same person online. Now, I mean, there's nothing we can do about that, but price sensitivity online for online news is huge. I do believe this, and this is something I actually meant to talk about. One thing Murdoch was doing a year ago that I thought was a really good idea. He was negotiating with Bing. Do you guys all know who Bing is? What Bing is? Who Bing is? Bing Crosby. Do you know what Bing is? He was negotiating, for those of you who don't know, Bing is Microsoft's search engine that is intending to compete with Google search engine. He was negotiating with Bing to have Wall Street Journal and the other publications be exclusively linkable through Bing, and Bing would pay for that. And then to protect Bing's investment, those Wall Street Journal and the other News Corp publications would have paywalls. You guys all know what a paywall is. They'd have paywalls so that you wouldn't ruin Bing's investment by getting onto the journal's website and getting it that way. You'd have to pay. So the idea there, and my brother and I thought that was good, because what would happen is Bing would effectively subsidize the content. Bing's payments for exclusivity in competition with Google would basically be paying for the news. And that, in conjunction with advertising and the modest amount of money they'd probably get from a paywall, might work in the online environment. And that's something we thought, having the search engines compete for exclusivity to link to a news originator's website would be good. However, you'd still have to do what we advocate. You can't have Murdoch charging you $40 to get the Daily if an aggregator is giving you a very close substitute of the same content for free or for a much lesser price. So you still would need the legal change that we're describing so that the Daily can make it. The Daily needs to have lead time to commercially exploit its content before that content is good. One of the problems you have here that's unlike anything else, any other service that I can think of, is the freshness with which news has commercial value. Its commercial value is very short. So you spend a lot of money to create commercial value, or to create news, but the news's commercial value is maybe a day, and the next day it's all new. It's all different. Yeah, and the newspapers implicitly recognize that the commercial value of their news is only as good until the next day, because then they replace it with something completely new and completely different. So when you have that kind of a problem, your commercial value doesn't last. You've got to give Murdoch some lead time before people rip off his stuff and create aggregator summaries. You've got to give him some time. The law has to give him a window to make money on the content that he does have. I think he has 100 journalists, doesn't he, really originating news. That's not a lot of journalists at all for a national news publication. That's nothing. But it's still originating news, and without stealing it from somebody else. So I think that the Daily's ability to succeed might be influenced by the absence of the legal landscape that we advocate. And I think if you had our legal landscape, it would really help the Daily. Your other questions?
How likely is it that the law will change to something similar to what you're recommending?
Well, I think unless the publishers demand it, it won't change. And the publishers are greatly fractured about what to do about this problem, as I think I mentioned before. And as long as they're stymied by disagreement and indecision will yield the kinds of economic problems they're experiencing, and nothing can stop it. What's your other question?
Well, I asked about why isn't this a business model issue, and some of that was directed at light of the fact that the Daily has been produced. They're willing to make an entrepreneurial investment into that market, knowing full well that there's going to be aggregators. There is aggregators for things like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post and so on and so forth that he already does deal with. Why aren't they, these, as businesses, aiming to create a new model that builds not just usership but loyalty? And I think that would be key, because if we could develop that, then I'm going to go to the Daily or the Wall Street Journal or whatever, depending on your preference of.
Well, they're certainly trying that. You know, that what happened this month, I suppose you got, am I telling you something you already know about the publishers' negotiations with Apple and Google about subscription services? Do you guys know about what that is all about? I'll tell you if you don't know. It's just happened, like within the last week. Apple says you can use the iPad or iPhone, let's say the plain dealer. People who have iPad or iPhone can subscribe to the plain dealer through the App Store. You guys know what Apple's App Store is? And however, if you do that, Apple will keep 30% of the subscription revenue and won't give you direct access to the data that shows demographics of those users, or whatever limited demographic Apple gets. I imagine it's fairly limited, but and Google said, "Oh, well, we'll beat Apple. We'll let you, if you come to the Droid, we'll only take 10% of your subscription revenue, and we'll let you have direct access to the data about your subscribers." And that's going on right now. That competition. I'm a little disappointed in it, because what I would like to see, instead of Google and Apple fighting over how much revenue from the originators they're going to take, I'd rather they fought over how much were they would. I would have thought that the Wall Street Journal is an example, or maybe the New York Times is such an iconic example. Well, let's say the Washington Post. I would have thought that the Post's desirability would be so high that Google would be saying, "I'll tell you what, Post, we'll pay you to be an exclusive app on the Droid." That's what I thought was going to happen. And it's coming close to that when Google says we'll only take 10% of your subscription revenue. But competition amongst smartphones and tablet companies could lead to that, where somebody's saying, "Hey, Washington Post, I'll pay you to enter into an exclusive deal with me that the Post app is only on my software." That's what I'd like to see happen. Maybe something like that will happen, but it seems unlikely that it would happen with very many publishers, if it happens, if it would ever happen. And the publishers maybe don't want that exclusivity. Maybe they don't want to be just on Droid. They're afraid that too few people will be accessing them. And you know that I have to admit, I have the iPad and the iPhone. The iPhone's the best thing I ever bought in my whole life. I have never had anything I liked as much as that. I can see why people like it. Oh, it's just friggin' fantastic. You know? And you don't have to be like a computer whiz to make it do everything. You can tell just by looking at it what to do next, which you cannot do with a Microsoft product. I'm very anti-Microsoft because I don't know what to do most of the time. Another question. Yeah.
What do you think of the Right Haven copyright infringement suits?
I disagree with those. And what he's talking about is Right Haven is the publisher of a Las Vegas newspaper that, in order to combat the kind of problem that I'm describing, is using the Copyright Act to go after aggregators who summarize or trade on links to Right Haven's newspapers. And the reason I don't like it is the reason I don't like using the Copyright Act at all here. When Gawker rewrites the Washington, did I tell you the Gawker story? I told you that. I didn't tell you the Gawker story? Was that your class? Let me tell you the Gawker story really fast. Ian Shapiro of the Washington Post spent 3 days researching and writing a story, a profile of a woman who had a very unusual consulting business. And the Post put that story online at 6 a.m. one day, and by 7 a.m. Gawker had a rewrite of it. So Ian called the guy who wrote Gawker's rewrite, and he said, yeah, it took me about 45 minutes to rewrite it, and then we put it on. It wasn't just like a headline with a link. It was a whole page with a link. Well, if you read our papers, you know that what we're concerned with is substitutes. If Gawker is a close substitute in the marketplace for the Post article, then readers won't read the Post article. Gawker will gain audience. Gawker will charge ad rates that are above its modest costs and drive the market for advertising down. So when Gawker takes Ian Shapiro's story, rewrites it, what is attractive to Gawker about that story? It's not Ian's wonderful prose. I can tell you that's not what's attracting him. What's attracting him are the facts that Ian described, and the facts that it took Ian 3 days to uncover and then write about. It's the facts that attract the aggregator, and copyright doesn't apply to the facts. Copyright, as a matter of constitutional law, copyright doesn't apply to facts. And so it doesn't apply to the sweat of your brow in gathering information and reporting it. It only applies to the language you used to describe the facts. And even then, the fair use doctrine, which I assume you guys know enough that I don't have to go into it, the fair use doctrine would allow me to take what Roy wrote and verbatim take it and sell it. As long as what I take satisfies the fair use doctrine, which is a highly unpredictable doctrine. So, in answer to your question, I am against the idea, for example, that Righthaven has a copyright in the facts, or that you could use copyright to suppress people from reporting Righthaven's facts. And this actually leads me to one other thing. I feel like I really have to say this. It's not in the papers, and it's really important. People in journalism and intellectual property lawyers, they all, I think, missed the boat to some extent when they try to decide how to make online news viable as a business. And that's this. People don't seem to want to, people look at the news like Righthaven does as their property, which would mean that they own it for 95 years. I'm not too anxious to have anybody own the news for 95 years, or for even more than half a day. But Righthaven and others, and intellectual property lawyers, they'll say, well, this is our property. And they will try to, using intellectual skills, try to explain why a particular news story is covered by copyright, which we are against that. But on the other end of the spectrum, the people who don't want to see the newspapers have any protection, the originators of news have any protection, they say, well, news should be free. What is it? Information wants to be free. And why should anybody have a monopoly on information? Well, neither of them are right, in our view. And by our, I mean my brother and me. News has two really important purposes that are mutually exclusive in some ways, and in other ways they overlap. News is knowledge, but that knowledge can't grow, can't be produced if you don't also recognize that news is a commercial service. So what the trick for the law is this. The law has to protect news as knowledge, meaning when he originates a story in the Plain Dealer, I can go talk about it. I can reiterate it. I can give a lecture about it. I can talk about it at a bar. I can put it in my newsletter to my friends. News as knowledge. The law has to protect news as knowledge. So news has to be not a monopoly of somebody. The news can't recognize property in facts. I can't give you the right to exclude all others from your news that you gathered. I can't give you that right. The law, society can't give that to you. But society does have to protect the investment you made to gather the news so that it can become knowledge. And how is that going to happen? It's the only way that I think the legal landscape could ever do that is through the tort that we advocate be resurrected, which is an unfair competition tort used only against direct competitors and would only prevent your use of my originating stuff during the very brief commercial life that I have. And that wouldn't be done by statute, it would be done by common law, which is appellate decisions that, in effect, make law. Go ahead.
That's the last question we have time for.
What would you say about quotations? If what you're advocating for is adopted, and a blogger cited a quotation from the newspaper on their blog, I mean, is that considered freeloading under your view? Should that blogger have gone out and, gotten that quote on his or her own, or where do you draw the line in terms of?
Well, the beauty of torts is you don't necessarily draw the line in the kind of mechanical way that you're describing. What I would do in, let's say, in the Gawker situation, if I'm the Washington Post and Gawker is persistently taking my stuff and rewriting it and competing with me in the marketplace in real time, if they did that persistently, I'm going to sue and say you're unjustly competing with me, unjustly enriching yourself, and it's got to stop. Is there a line? No, there's not a line.
What do you say about the quotation?
Well, what I would say is if you persistently, persistently competed with me by creating a substitute for my original news, quoting me isn't creating a substitute for my news. It's when you rewrite enough of it that people go to you for my news instead of coming to me. And when that happens consistently, there's a tort. And that tort is unfair competition if you are, in fact, a commercial competitor and you're competing against me in real time. I don't look at it as a property issue. I look at it as a tort, a civil wrong that is only between people with a particular relational interest. And that relational interest would be direct competitor, real time, close substitute. You using my stuff to create a close substitute for my stuff in the marketplace so that people read you instead of reading me and I'm the real originator. And if a blogger does that, the blogger is liable in my view. But to say all bloggers are liable because they work off of something Roy has originated, that would not be the case. It's when they work so much off of his stuff that they become a substitute for him using his own stuff. And when that happens, the law's got to step in and create some liability.
Okay, we got to let that be the last word. Please join me in thanking Mr. Marburger.